I'm
Um,
Darian.
I'm
Darian.
Andrew.
And I'm Matt.
Andrew, I don't think we heard you, but
I'm Andrew.
there he is.
Sorry about that.
Awesome.
Alrighty, so for our research proposal, we're deciding which component of cognition we wanted to study, and we narrowed it down to memory, and specifically how a disease affecting memory has an impact on our short-term memory, our iconic memory, and our reading speed, and how that affects that. So, yeah.
Awesome. So just a little bit of background before we get into what exactly our experiment is. So we read quite a few articles about Alzheimer's and the effects that it has on memory and language ability. And one thing that we saw pretty commonly, and it seems pretty well known and well addressed in the past, is that as Alzheimer's progresses and as it progressively gets worse, memory and language ability are progressively compromised as well. So as Alzheimer's moves on to late onset Alzheimer's, memory gets worse and language ability gets worse alongside it. So one really common way that was used throughout these studies to show a decrease in reading ability was the study of saccadic eye movements. So if you don't know what saccadic eye movements are, there's a little picture in the top right corner. I'm circling with my mouse. And it's kind of just a little diagram showing a little bit what it is. But basically, when we're reading, we move our eyes back and forth across the page. So for example, we'll move our eyes to the next few words, and maybe even sometimes we'll move them backwards to pick up details that perhaps we didn't see the first time we were reading. And so saccadic eye movements are pretty highly correlated with reading speed. And so one thing that's been shown in those with Alzheimer's again and again is that people with Alzheimer's have irregular saccadic eye movements, which results in reading slowing down and results in increased fixation times, meaning like longer periods of time between each saccadic eye movement. However, there isn't yet very convincing evidence that these phenomena are linked to a deficit in visual sensory memory or iconic memory. So that's what, like Darian said, that's kind of the topic we're looking at, is how does this decrease in reading speed correlate to a decrease in iconic or visual memory? And so our hypothesis is that we believe that there'll be a strong positive correlation between those two variables, meaning as someone's iconic and visual memory get worse, that their reading speed will see a similar decrease. Yeah, that's our hypothesis.
Yeah, and then going on to the methods and materials and all of that, we decided for our experiment that there were a few materials that we absolutely needed. The first, to test reading speed, it's pretty obvious we need reading materials. Specifically, we want to get like a short story or a series of short stories that are the 5th grade level. So people with Alzheimer's are capable of understanding and reading, and same with people who may not be as well educated who are participating in the experiment. We also need a 500 hertz binocular remote eye tracker. And what that will do is it will keep track of eye movements while reading. So that's obviously really important for this experiment. And then a computer is also very necessary, not just for keeping track of data and being able to run tests for the researchers, but also because when we perform a memory task, which I'll explain later on, they'll need a computer to see, at least a monitor to see events related to that memory task. As far as participants are concerned, we have, I guess, like 4 different groups of individuals that we need. We need 10 people who are ages 50 to 55 with early onset Alzheimer's, 10 people in that same age range that are neurotypical, and then 10 people who are 65 to 70 with late onset Alzheimer's, and then 10 more people who fall in that age range as well. And then it's also really important that when we get the sample, that we have the same number of guys and girls, the same number of males and females. That will eliminate confounding variables that may be related towards gender or sex, and so be very helpful in making the experiment more sound. As far as methods and procedures, individuals will arrive at our testing location. They'll be divided into 2 groups based off of whether they were neurotypical or whether they had Alzheimer's. And then each individual will be randomly assigned to either do the reading task first or the memory task first. And the reason we want to randomly assign them in that situation is because maybe if you do the reading task first, you are able to perform better on the memory task as a result, or vice versa. And that will just eliminate confounding variables related to which assignment they have first if we randomize that. And then we will collect the data as they perform these tasks. And at the very end of the experiment, we'll debrief the participants on everything that had to do with the experiment, what it was for, all the information that you're supposed to include in a debrief. And then once they're gone, we will analyze the data and come to a conclusion and report it appropriately. And then the tasks themselves, I'll explain a little bit. The reading task, what we will have the participants do is they'll read a short story, as I mentioned, at the 5th grade level. And they'll be reading this while they're connected to the 500 hertz binocular remote eye tracker, and that will track their saccadic eye movements as they're reading that material. And then for the memory task, participants will be asked to see a series of letters, and they're going to appear on a screen, and then they'll have to remember those letters and report them, and we'll just measure their accuracy in reporting and remembering the series of letters included and appearing on that screen. So yeah.
Alrighty, so for the results section, just from what Stephen already talked about, and he mentioned that we already know that Alzheimer's is linked to problems in memories, and that it would likely affect reading. So we would expect that those 2 variables would be correlated, just that Alzheimer's disease, the higher one scores on an assessment test, the more irregular Alzheimer's symptoms that they exhibit, then the more errors and impairment they would show in reading. So this probably would look similar to this graph on the right. You can see that the best bet line shows that the 2 are correlated, and like, for example, for a decrease in reading speed, you'd probably see the line going the opposite direction.
Yeah, and also going back to what Stephen talked about with the hypothesis, what we're kind of expecting is to find not only a correlation between Alzheimer's and deficits in iconic memory and deficits in reading speed. We're expecting a correlation between those 2 deficits that will kind of go together in Alzheimer's patients, as opposed to neurotypical individuals. So since we'll have 2 sets of data because of the 2 tests, we're going to perform 2 separate statistical tests. So the test that we picked out is a t-test, which is just a type of statistical test where you take a distribution of what the values would be if they kind of had an expected variation from the mean, and what there would be if there weren't any correlation. And then from this test, we get a p-value, and the greater the p-value, the more our data match the expected data that would kind of show that there's no correlation. So if we get a p-value that's lower than 0.05, which is kind of a pretty common threshold for whether data is significant. If we get something lower than that, then we'll feel pretty safe in going ahead and saying that, yeah, there is a link between presence of Alzheimer's and these deficits or impairment in iconic memory and reading speed. So if we do get these results, then we'll have found a possible link between Alzheimer's and deficits in iconic memory and reading ability. And this might be pretty important findings. First, because as Stephen said at the beginning, like there isn't any evidence that we could find so far that Alzheimer's is correlated with deficits in iconic memory. And this would kind of pinpoint an area of difficulties in reading that Alzheimer's patients have, and a possible reason that they might be having these difficulties. So maybe if a study like this, or this study, is able to find that correlation, researchers could try to find medicines or therapies for the part of the brain. I think it's the hippocampus where iconic memory is located. So these results could end up being pretty important.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons we actually chose this topic was I think many of us have family members, whether usually older family members, that are maybe affected by Alzheimer's. And so it was just something we were all interested in and saw the importance of. One of my grandparents had pretty early onset Alzheimer's. I don't actually remember them very well, to be honest. Ironically enough, I was pretty young when they passed away, but my parents do remember them, and it was pretty hard. It was pretty hard for them and their siblings as well. So yeah, it's an important study.
Thank you.